Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, October 27th, 1964, Ronald Reagan burst onto the scene with what is commonly known as his A Time for Choosing speech. The speech solidified his standing as a Republican star, even though he had been a Democrat as recently as 1962. But it all started to come together for Reagan after that speech. A year later, he announced he was running for governor of California. And of course, after serving as governor, he would go on to serve as president, probably, Niki can correct me on this, probably the most important figure in conservative politics in the last 60 years or so. Here to discuss that turning point speech is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody. Yes, I think most important conservative figure in 60 years. I'll give him that.
Yeah, I think he's got that. And I, of course, wrote this intro and said he burst onto the scene. That isn't exactly right. And that's kind of actually where I want to start because, well, first off, he was an actor. So when you say burst onto the scene, he kind of like walked onto the scene and stole the spotlight. But also I think Reagan's political awakening was something that sort of developed over the course of seemingly decades. And this speech seems in many ways to really both be a capstone, but also really represent that kind of long awakening. So, what is in this speech and what does it tell us about Reagan's move from actor to political figure?
Yeah, I mean, we often use that phrase political evolution, but I think in the case of Reagan, political evolution is the right word because it really is like tectonic plates shifting over the course of more than a decade because he had been a kind of New Deal Democrat. He had been asked by Democrats to run in 1946 and 1952 for Congress, but he was hired by GE to give these speeches about kind of the state of the world, about politics, which was something that Reagan cared a lot about. And now he's giving these speeches for a massive corporation. He's a fairly wealthy actor at this point. And his speech begins to hit on themes of like, maybe taxes should be lower. Maybe government should be smaller. And he begins to develop this kind of libertarian economic policy. He's reading a lot of conservative economic books at this point in time that he then fuses with a kind of social message. Although that social message, that social politics doesn't really come to the fore until he's governor of California. But this speech was a long time in the making.
Yeah. And so actually, let's talk a little bit about the sort of actual nature of this speech. We call it a speech, but it was sort of like you mentioned it was that he was doing a lot of stuff for GE. It was sort of like an infomercial, right?
Yeah. So this was like a 30-minute televised spot. So we think about those 30-second ads that we get now. Maybe every once in a while it might be 1 minute or 2 minutes. But this was 30 minutes of Reagan laying out his political vision. He was doing this for Barry Goldwater. So we're just like a week away from the 1964 election. Goldwater is doing really badly in the polls. Reagan doesn't mention him very much. But Goldwater is sort of the new standard bearer of the conservative movement. And Reagan's coming in and he's giving you a vision of what conservatism could look like if it was a little less scary, a little less atomic focused than Barry Goldwater, what a softer, kinder conservatism might look like.
And I think that's really an important point. Well, this was a time when you could buy 30 minutes to just have someone give a political speech on national television and millions and millions and millions of people would see it. But also, it's come up a few times on this show, but that moment when you're heading into an election and the person who's on your party's ticket is likely to lose, there is that really interesting vacuum. We've noted this often when we've talked about conventions, but there is that interesting vacuum for people to make a name for themselves. And I think that's exactly what Reagan did here. As you said, in the speech, he doesn't necessarily do a standard stump speech, vote for Goldwater. He does stuff like, I'm going to quote here, but he says, "The founding fathers knew a government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they knew when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. So we have come to a time for choosing," which is the name of the speech, "a time for choosing. You and I are told we must choose between a left or right, but I suggest there is no such thing as left or right. There is only an up or down." That is really powerful, stirring stuff, well delivered, but also it just seems like that just must set the DNA for conservative language and conservative ideals for generations and generations. I mean, you could hear someone giving that speech. Maybe not Donald Trump, but you could hear someone giving that speech, a Republican giving that speech today.
You could imagine Paul Ryan giving that speech, or somebody perhaps maybe a little more charismatic than Ryan. But yeah, this idea that he had found the right way to pitch this message that took away some of the harsher edges. The thing that conservatism was always being criticized for was being kind of heartless, being passionless, being too hard-edged. And if you look at earlier versions of this speech, the kind that Reagan was giving in the 1950s, it was more conspiratorial, it was darker, but he found that didn't resonate with his audiences. So he had figured out how to give this message of conservative politics in a way that was much more appealing, much more stirring. And here's the fact that he's an actor comes into play in a lot of ways, but also that this was something that he'd been really working on, trying to find the right way to deliver this message, something Goldwater just could not do. But Reagan, as you mentioned, he becomes the guy in the wake of Goldwater's loss.
Well, and to sort of further highlight that evolution that you were talking about in terms of just almost tone and presentation, the last time Reagan's name came up on our podcast was when we were talking about the HUAC hearings in 1947, which had exactly that tone you're describing, that kind of sinister, communists are among us, we're ratting people out. And Reagan, testified during that. I did go back and watch some of his testimony when we were prepping for that episode. He, I'm stating the obvious here, very charismatic, but still he was in that context of red hunting and commies are here. And so I think you see that evolution here. That said, I mean, obviously anti-communism seems to be the biggest storyline for Ronald Reagan and seems to have been the linchpin thing that transitioned him from a New Deal Democrat into what he would become.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. His experiences as the head of the Screen Actors Guild, his experiences with HUAC, all of those were part of this moment where anti-communism and this particular kind of conspiratorial, life or death, up or down kind of anti-communism becomes the linchpin for all conservatism, for holding together the libertarians with the social conservatives. They're united together by this anti-communism, and Reagan is sort of the personification of that fusion of new conservative ideas with anti-communism at its heart. Now, Barry Goldwater was that way too. I mean, he was more libertarian, but when he talked about communism, he scared people because he would talk about using nuclear weapons. And there was a real concern that he would somehow get the U.S. into a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So what Reagan did was he was able to have that hardline message still be at the heart of his politics, but he was able to do it without frightening people, which was a big evolutionary step for conservatism.
Yeah. Some interesting things about that 64 race itself in the wake of this speech. Obviously, people started to pay attention to Ronald Reagan even more than they had been. It did serve, in a sense, its purpose. You read some of the reports at the time, and it says that in the wake of the speech, Goldwater's campaign got $1 million in donations, which was a lot of money, and apparently so much money that they didn't even have the ability to spend it in the closing days of the election. Goldwater did close the gap by 5 points. He still lost by a ton to LBJ. But as a surrogate speech, I mean, this did seem to kind of do its job, or as good a job as you could hope given the circumstances.
Yeah, to be able to help close even that gap. I mean, it's still the largest landslide loss in U.S. history, but Reagan was able to point to what the future of conservatism could look like, which was actually really important because in the weeks after this speech, there was a real sense that conservatism was done. that Goldwater had been the face of American conservatism. It was this fringe ideology, and it had nowhere to go. Well, the place that it had to go was California. And you see a kind of remaking of the conservative movement in this period where there is a retreat from the national stage. There's this sense that, like, okay, Americans are not ready for this, but maybe Californians are ready for this. And so you see a lot of money going into these state races, including the governor's race in 1966 that Reagan ultimately wins, as they kind of retool and try to figure out, okay, how are we going to make conservatism more palatable, but also how are we going to start winning conservative victories if we're not yet able to do it at the national level?
So I guess, one question is, we've been talking about this as such a star-making moment and how there was this political vacuum with Republicans, and now he comes along and he's, the party sort of snaps to attention, but he doesn't go on to be the Republican nominee 4 years later. It's not like this meteoric burst onto the stage. He kind of has a failed bid. So why didn't it work out for him immediately? Why did it take another couple cycles for him to then end up being the standard bearer?
So I think for a couple of reasons. One, he was someone who didn't have any real political history. He'd given this great speech, but he hadn't ever run for office. He'd never held office before. And so he needs that experience in California for even conservatives to take him seriously. But I think, too, Republicans were wary about running a conservative again. Goldwater's loss was pretty scarring. And then you had somebody like Richard Nixon running in 1968 who had learned a lot from Goldwater's loss. He had learned that, okay, well, you definitely can't win the presidency with just the support of conservatives, but you can't win the Republican nomination without conservatives. So he had figured out how to triangulate in a way that Reagan, as sort of the standard bearer for conservatism going forward, nobody quite believed 4 years after Goldwater that even a kinder, gentler Goldwater could win an election.
So as we start to wrap up, by the time Reagan becomes president, he's quite old, and I think that's a big part of the Reagan story. I suppose if you have a 30-year political awakening, you're going to be pretty old by the time you're fully awake. But I'm curious kind of if, I'm obviously thinking of Trump here, but if we see this as much anymore, this really slow burn move towards politics seems a little different to me now. The story of Bernie Sanders is he was the same person in the 60s as he was in 2016. And then you have, obviously young politicians who are having their awakening from the moment. But this feels kind of almost unique in a sense that someone would really evolve this slowly and then still reach those heights.
Well, I think part of it is that the parties were changing a lot during this period. So a lot of people were undergoing all different sorts of political evolutions in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, particularly this switch from Democrat to Republican and vice versa as the parties start to change. His age was an issue. In 1980, when he ran, there were lots of conservatives coalescing around other candidates like Congressman Phil Crane because they didn't believe that Reagan was young enough to be president. People live longer now. You could reasonably argue that we are in something of a gerontocracy. So there is many more examples of older people holding office. But for him in 1980, it was a real issue.
Yeah. So actually, let me ask you about that, because this is something that I think about every once in a while when this stuff comes up. People do tend to point to the past and be like, oh, people thought Reagan was too old to run or that Eisenhower was too old to run. And they were, in their early 60s or whatever. And now, but people live longer now. And that's one of the things that has sort of changed the most in basically a generation is that people live very healthy lives into their 70s and 80s. So, that's not to say that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren aren't old, but I do think whenever someone makes that sort of quip or that comparison, I'm like, yeah, well, 70s now is kind of 60s 30 years ago.
Yeah. And look, medicine's a lot better. We have more women politicians and women tend to live longer and be healthier longer. And also those older politicians, as we talked about last time, had some health issues. Right? Eisenhower struggled with his health at a time when there weren't great medicines for heart attacks. And of course, Reagan was experiencing the onset of Alzheimer's by the end of his presidency. So I think that there still are those lingering prejudices, in part confirmed by those experiences for Eisenhower and Reagan.
Okay. Well, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of the Radiotopia network from PRX. Our producer and researcher is Jacob Feldman. Our other producer is Brittany Brown. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
Radiotopia.